Leningrad, winter, 1990. The air cuts like broken glass, and the streets look staged for a funeral. Lee Remick, elegant, defiant, already sentenced by a doctor's whisper, steps into frame for what might be her last performance. This isn't a comeback. It's a countdown. She knows it. So does the man across from her, Maximilian Schell, the enigmatic co-star whom critics call magnetic and friends call unknowable. Nights are long. Hotel corridors feel like tunnels. Between takes, she writes, sharp, unfiltered lines bled straight from the vein. The private diary of a public woman. Words that would never fit into a press junket or an award speech. Words about desire, regret, and the kind of attachment that arrives too late and burns too hot. Her family will try to seal those pages, to keep the rawest parts of her from being consumed by the same people who bought tickets to her pain. But secrets, like stage lights, eventually find their mark. You know the legend. Anatomy of a murder, a courtroom glance that could sway a jury. Days of wine and roses, the slow drowning you can't look away from. What you don't know is the cost. How a 7-year contract can feel like a set of cuffs. How a starlet learns to smile through humiliation. How research for a role takes you into rooms where people confess to bottles what they would never admit to God. So, what did she write about Schell in that Russian winter? Was it confession or absolution? An apology to herself for a life spent performing other people's truths? Tonight, we open the file Hollywood didn't want you to see. The Case of Lee Remick, her final script written in her own hand. Quincy, Massachusetts. On the surface, it looked like the American dream. A Harvard-educated father, a successful department store, and a picture book family home. For young Lee Remick, life seemed steady, predictable, safe. But in 1942, when she was just 7 years old, that picture cracked. Her parents divorced, a scandal in that era, and the foundation of her childhood collapsed overnight. Stability, the thing she would spend her life chasing, was gone. Her mother, Gertrude, once a hopeful stage actress, suddenly found herself a single parent in a world with no safety nets for women. She packed what little they had and moved Lee and her brother Bruce to New York City. The descent was swift, from comfort to near poverty, from security to survival. For Lee, this wasn't just a change of address. It was a rude education in fragility. In Manhattan, Gertrude made unimaginable sacrifices to enroll her daughter at Miss Hewitt's, one of the city's most exclusive girls' schools. Lee studied alongside the daughters of industrialists and socialites, hearing casual talk of summers in Europe, while she carried the quiet shame of an empty bank account. She likely survived on reduced tuition or scholarships, a fact that only deepened her sense of being an outsider. It was a wound that never healed, but it also gave her a rare depth, an ability to understand women caught between worlds, women who never quite belonged. At the same time, Lee trained in ballet under the unforgiving eye of Russian teacher Maria Swoboda. The lessons were brutal. Hours of repetition left her feet bloodied, her shoes stained with crimson. But Remick refused to quit. The discipline wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She learned to channel pain into performance, a survival mechanism she would later deploy in Hollywood when the cameras demanded everything and offered little in return. There was rebellion in her blood, too. Her maternal great-grandmother, Eliza Duffield, had been one of the rare female preachers of the 19th century, defying convention and building her own congregation. This legacy of defiance would echo through Lee's own roles, characters torn between desire and duty, craving freedom in a world that sought to cage them. By the time she was a teenager, the contradictions of her life had hardened into a kind of quiet steel. She was the poor girl in a rich girl's school, the disciplined dancer with bruised feet, the daughter of a broken home still dreaming of the stage. It was the perfect storm that forged her persona. Fragile enough to seem breakable, yet strong enough to never shatter. In those years, the seeds of her screen presence were planted. She would one day mesmerize audiences not because she was flawless, but because she carried the shadow of loss and the fire of survival into every role. And Hollywood, always hungry for authenticity wrapped in beauty, was about to notice.
By 17, Lee Remick was already testing the rules. She saw an ad for dancers at the Music Circus in Hyannis, Massachusetts. The requirement was simple. You had to be at least 18. Lee wasn't. But rules were for other girls. She lied about her age, auditioned, and got the job. It was a dangerous gamble. If anyone had uncovered the truth, her reputation could have ended before it began. Instead, she fooled seasoned professionals, setting her career into motion. Broadway came next, but not as triumph. It arrived with humiliation. Be Your Age opened in January 1953 and collapsed 4 days later, a spectacular flop. For a young actress still balancing school, it was a public failure that could have ended everything. Yet, it didn't. The disaster introduced her to an agent, and with him, new doors. Sometimes in Hollywood, failure is just another kind of audition. The real turning point was pure chance. In 1956, television was still finding its power. Lee appeared on a small program, all expenses paid, broadcast with little fanfare. But fate was watching. More precisely, Elia Kazan was. The director who had reshaped cinema with On the Waterfront wasn't looking for talent that night, but something in Remick's presence caught his eye. She wasn't polished, she wasn't established, but she was real. He remembered her. The call came in 1957. Kazan wanted her for A Face in the Crowd. The role wasn't glamorous. A Southern majorette swept into the orbit of a rising demagogue. To prepare, Remick traveled to Arkansas weeks before shooting, living with a local family, training with baton twirlers until her hands blistered. When the cameras rolled, she didn't just play the girl, she was the girl. Among thousands of extras and in the sweltering August heat, she glowed with an authenticity that even Hollywood couldn't fake. That performance changed everything. It wasn't just a role, it was a declaration. She had stepped out of the shadows of failed plays and fraudulent resumes into the blinding light of cinema. The poor girl from New York's margins, the ballet student with bloodied shoes, the teenager who lied to get a job, suddenly, she was a rising star. But Hollywood doesn't give without taking. By the time the film was released, 20th Century Fox moved quickly to secure her. A 7-year contract followed. On paper, lucrative, promising stability she had never known. But in truth, it was another kind of trap. Fox would decide her roles, her image, even her future. She was about to learn that in Hollywood, success often comes chained to the same kind of confinement she had spent her life running from. The curtain was rising for Lee Remick's glory years. But in the wings, the darkness of control and compromise was already waiting. When Lee Remick signed her name on that 20th Century Fox contract, it seemed like security at last. A steady paycheck, a studio determined to promote her. To anyone watching from the outside, she was about to ascend into the Hollywood stratosphere. But the fine print of the deal read like shackles. 1 film a year, chosen entirely by Fox. No control, no freedom. She was an employee in a factory disguised as a dream. The studio knew what it wanted her to be. The blonde ingenue, the Southern belle, the decorative accent in a man's story. Her hair, her eyes, her cheekbones. These were her calling cards. Her depth, her discipline, her hunger to act. Those were harder to market. And so, year after year, Fox placed her in roles designed to showcase the surface, not the soul. But every once in a while, Hollywood loses its grip, and something real slips through the cracks. For Lee, that moment was Anatomy of a Murder, 1959. She wasn't supposed to dominate the screen. She was meant to play a victim, a supporting player. Yet the way she removed her glasses on the witness stand, shaking her hair loose, transformed the entire scene. Vulnerable but daring, innocent yet suggestive, it was electric. Audiences leaned forward, censors panicked, and critics saw something studios had missed. Lee Remick wasn't just decoration, she was dangerous. The role catapulted her from promising newcomer to star. But stardom came with shadows. On the set of The Long Hot Summer, Orson Welles turned workdays into minefields. He was unpredictable, manipulative, and at times predatory. One moment, he'd ignore his lines. The next, he'd make advances that left her shaken. The studio buried the incident, but for Lee, the lesson was written in stone. Hollywood could elevate you with one hand and violate you with the other. Yet she refused to break. Directors like Otto Preminger, notorious for cruelty, found themselves disarmed by her calm. She learned every line, not just her own, but everyone's, so she could never be caught unprepared. When Preminger screamed, she didn't cry. She stared him down. Slowly, the industry began to realize she was more than a pretty face. She was iron wrapped in velvet. Then came the role that defined her artistry. Days of Wine and Roses, 1962. Opposite Jack Lemmon, she played a woman destroyed by alcohol, a descent filmed with brutal honesty. To prepare, she sat in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, absorbing the raw confessions of strangers. What she brought to the screen wasn't melodrama, it was truth. Quiet, devastating, undeniable. Audiences expecting a light-hearted lemon comedy fled the theater, but critics stayed. And so did history. The performance earned her an Oscar nomination, her only one, and cemented her as one of the finest actresses of her generation. Behind the cameras, her personal life mirrored her professional confinement. In 1957, at just 21, she married William Arthur Colleran, a television director with credits on The Dean Martin Show and Your Hit Parade. To outsiders, it was romantic. To insiders, it was a mismatch. Colleran was controlling, and Lee was ambitious. Together, they were combustible. They had 2 children, Catherine and Matthew, but by the mid-1960s, she was telling friends she felt trapped in 2 prisons, her studio contract and her marriage. Gossip columnists reported their public fights at Hollywood parties. In 1968, the divorce became official, ugly, drawn out, and costly. Professionally, Fox continued to hold her back. Esteemed directors like Billy Wilder and John Huston wanted her, but exclusivity clauses slammed the door. She was a star, yes, but a caged one. At 24, she had already learned what many actresses never admitted aloud. In Hollywood, beauty could be a prison, and talent wasn't always the key. Still, in the midst of restriction, she found moments of triumph. In Wild River, she worked alongside Montgomery Clift, a man haunted by his own demons after a disfiguring car accident. Watching his fragility, Lee realized that great acting often came from brokenness, from allowing wounds to bleed on screen. She never forgot it. Her choices became more selective. She said once, "I make movies for grown-ups. When Hollywood starts making them again, I'll start acting in them again." It was a quiet rebellion, but it revealed her disillusionment. She wasn't chasing fame anymore. She was chasing honesty. And that honesty made her glow, even when the scripts didn't. By the early 1960s, Lee Remick had become more than a starlet. She was a paradox, the poised beauty who had survived humiliation, the disciplined dancer who had endured predators, the young mother balancing glamour with grief. She had tasted both the glory of critical acclaim and the bitterness of contracts that silenced her. The world saw the rising star, the glowing ingenue, the actress who could make a courtroom scene sizzle with a flick of her hair. What they didn't see were the scars, hidden behind flawless makeup, stitched beneath designer gowns. Scars from a broken childhood, from toxic marriages, from studio deals that felt less like opportunity and more like ownership. Lee Remick had risen, yes, but the price of glory in Hollywood was never just fame. It was surrender. It was survival. And for Lee, it was the beginning of a long war between the woman she was and the woman the industry wanted her to be.
Hollywood is a place where dreams shine brightest in the dark. For Lee Remick, the shadows began closing in just as her star reached its peak. On the set of The Long Hot Summer, she discovered how fragile power could be. Orson Welles, a titan of cinema, had joined the cast more to pay his debts than to tell a story. He showed up late, ignored his lines, and tested the patience of everyone around him. For a young actress still proving herself, Welles was intimidating, too powerful to confront, too reckless to trust. One day, in the middle of a scene, he crossed the line, making advances that left her shaken. The studio buried the incident. Hollywood always buried these things. But for Lee, the scar was permanent. Then came Otto Preminger. Known for his volcanic temper, he had reduced seasoned actors to rubble. When Lee joined him on Anatomy of a Murder, everyone expected her to break. Instead, she disarmed him. She arrived on set knowing not only her lines, but everyone's. When Preminger raged, she stared back, calm and unflinching. In time, even he respected her. Yet the lesson was brutal. In Hollywood, survival meant armor. Vulnerability was for the screen, not the set. But battles weren't confined to studios. Her marriage to William Arthur Colleran, already fragile, became a prison of its own. Gossip columnists reported their public fights, whispers of control and resentment. Friends recalled her describing her life as two prisons, one named Fox, the other marriage. By 1968, both cages had collapsed, but freedom came with a cost, a bruised reputation and a bitter custody battle. Career choices grew riskier. In 1962, Days of Wine and Roses had earned her an Oscar nomination, but her next ventures revealed Hollywood's cruelty. On Broadway, Anyone Can Whistle collapsed after only 9 performances. Though critics praised her voice, the failure followed her. And in 1968, she starred opposite Frank Sinatra in The Detective. Her character was written as a nymphomaniac, portrayed with raw bluntness. Audiences weren't ready. They laughed during her most vulnerable scenes. What was meant to be brave became a spectacle, and the laughter stayed with her for years. Lee began to see the rot in the system. She once told a reporter, "I make movies for grown-ups. When Hollywood starts making them again, I'll start acting in them again." It wasn't a quip. It was a quiet confession of disillusionment. She watched his serious films struggle while shows like The Beverly Hillbillies drew millions. For Lee, it wasn't just about art. It was about values, about what America chose to elevate. Her refusal to play the game cost her. In an industry where survival often meant cultivating fake charm, Lee was honest, straightforward. She didn't flatter the right people, didn't master the art of manipulation. As Elia Kazan once told her, "You don't have claws." He was right. Lee Remick was a fighter, but not a schemer, and Hollywood punished her for it. Even her triumphs carried hidden wounds. In Wild River in 1960, she worked closely with Montgomery Clift, watching the slow unraveling of a once brilliant actor. For her, it was a devastating lesson in fragility, a mirror of her own fears, that talent and beauty could crumble overnight, leaving only shadows. By the late 1960s, Lee Remick was caught in a paradox. To the public, she was radiant, an actress of elegance and depth. But behind the glow lay disappointment, exploitation, and a growing weariness with the very system that had made her famous. She had survived the predators, outlasted the tyrants, and escaped the prisons of marriage and studio contracts. But freedom came with a price. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Hollywood didn't want Lee Remick the artist, it wanted Lee Remick the illusion. And illusions, no matter how beautiful, eventually crack.
By the late 1960s, Lee Remick was no longer the ingenue Hollywood once promised. The cracks were visible, personal, professional, and public. In 1968, her marriage to William Colleran ended after 11 years of tension, custody battles, and whispered scandals at Hollywood parties. But what came next would stain her reputation in ways the studios couldn't spin. She fell in love with Kip Gowans, a British assistant director. The problem? Gowans was already married to actress Valerie Guerin and had 2 children. The affair was an open wound in the press. To an industry obsessed with image, the story was poison. Suddenly, Lee Remick, the Academy Award nominee, the elegant star, was recast as a homewrecker. Producers worried that her name on a marquee would scare audiences away, so she made a choice most stars never dared. She left. She and Gowans fled Hollywood for London, buying a home in St. John's Wood. To some, it looked like running. To others, it was love's last gamble. In truth, it was both. By leaving, she severed ties with 20th Century Fox, abandoned major film offers, and surrendered the spotlight that had once been hers. In England, she continued to work. Television dramas, historical films, roles that earned awards, but the momentum of Hollywood glory was gone. She had traded celebrity for survival. Then came the cruelest blow. In 1989, just as she was preparing to remarry Gowans officially, she received the diagnosis: kidney cancer. Doctors were blunt. The disease was advanced, the options limited. In her own words, it came like a thunderbolt. For a woman who had lived her entire life battling instability, divorce, contracts, the fickleness of fame, this was the final enemy she couldn't outwit. And yet, true to form, Lee refused to collapse. She fought quietly, without theatrics. Even as her body weakened, she accepted roles. In 1990, she traveled to Russia to film Catherine the Great, playing a manipulative mother alongside Maximilian Schell. Those freezing nights in Leningrad became her last stage. Between scenes, she filled her diary with raw, unguarded words about Schell. Confessions her family later tried to hide. It was the final, secret chapter of a woman who had spent her career living inside other people's scripts, but never truly able to tell her own story. By the summer of 1991, the battle was over. Lee stopped aggressive treatment and chose to remain at home in Brentwood, surrounded by her husband, her children, her stepchildren. On July 2nd, she died at just 55. The tabloids called it a tragic end, but for those who knew her, it was a release. A woman who had endured so much, finally choosing peace. Her fall wasn't just about scandal or sickness. It was about the cost of honesty in a world built on lies. Lee Remick had refused to play the Hollywood game, and Hollywood had abandoned her. In the end, it wasn't the industry that defined her. It was the way she faced tragedy with the same quiet dignity she brought to the screen. On July 5, 1991, Hollywood gathered not on a film set, but in a quiet chapel in Los Angeles. The woman once called the fragile fire of American cinema was gone at just 55. At her funeral, Jack Lemmon spoke, his voice breaking as he remembered the partner who had matched his every note in Days of Wine and Roses. Gregory Peck, the embodiment of old Hollywood dignity, followed with his own tribute. Then, in the most haunting moment of the service, her children stood together and sang "Anyone Can Whistle," a song she had once performed on Broadway. It was a farewell steeped in the irony that had defined her life, a song about fragility, sung in honor of a woman who had survived so much. What remains of Lee Remick is not just the films, though there are many: Anatomy of a Murder, Wild River, The Detective, Days of Wine and Roses. It's the way she inhabited characters with bruised souls and trembling dignity, the way she carried her own scars onto the screen without asking for sympathy. She was never Hollywood's brightest star, never a box office queen, but she became something rarer, an actress audiences believed. Her diary entry about Maximilian Schell may have been the last secret to escape the shadows, but in truth, her entire life was a ledger of hidden costs. Contracts that silenced her, marriages that confined her, roles that demanded her pain. And yet, in the final accounting, she left behind something Hollywood couldn't corrupt: authenticity. Lee Remick's legacy is not the glitter of stardom,
but the glow of truth. In a town built on illusions, she refused to fake it, and for that, her light, fragile, flickering, but fiercely real, still burns. The diary closes, but the questions remain. Was Lee Remick's final confession about Maximilian Schell a love letter, a lament, or her last rebellion against the roles Hollywood forced her to play? We may never know the full truth, but perhaps that's the point. The screen gave us her beauty, her fragility, her strength, but the diary gave us her soul, raw and unfiltered. In a town built on facades, Lee dared to leave behind something real. And that's why, decades later, we're still searching the shadows of her story. If you've been captivated by this journey into the hidden files of Hollywood, subscribe to Beyond the Red Carpet. More secrets, more scandals, more untold truths are waiting. Classified stories you were never meant to hear, because in Hollywood, the case is never closed.